Your hands went cold. Your heart rate jumped before you understood why. Your gut dropped and your vision narrowed to a tunnel, and the air felt thinner even though nothing about the air had changed. Your body was afraid before your brain identified what scared you. The sequence took less time than it takes to blink. Then you stepped forward anyway. You did the thing. Whatever the thing was, the conversation, the confrontation, the edge, the room, the phone call, the predicted catastrophe did not arrive. And the next time that fear showed up, the recovery was shorter. The hands warmed faster. The heart settled sooner. Something had changed inside a circuit you never knew was being built. The fear was entirely familiar. The recovery was new, and the recovery kept getting shorter with each exposure, as though the body were learning something the conscious mind could not articulate. It was. The body was building a second circuit on top of the first, and the second circuit was the reason the fear stopped controlling the behavioral outcome, even though it never stopped firing. You have felt both of these your entire life. The body seizing up and the body learning to release, without knowing that each one runs through a physically different circuit, that the circuits operate simultaneously in one brain, and that every time you face the thing you fear, one circuit builds a connection that dampens the other. The fear is a circuit that fires in 50 to 70 milliseconds. The override is a circuit that takes months to construct. You have been building it every time you stepped forward. You have been losing it every time you stepped back. Which circuit grew depended on which direction you moved. The fear you feel today, its intensity, its duration, the speed at which your hands warm and your heart settles and your gut releases, is the accumulated result of every decision to face or avoid the feared stimulus across your entire adult life. The physics of both circuits is specific enough to measure, to map, and to change. How does the body become afraid before the brain identifies the threat? Visual information from the retina reaches the amygdala through a shortcut, a direct subcortical pathway, retina, to a midbrain structure called the superior colliculus, to a thalamic relay called the pulvinar to the amygdala, delivering low-resolution threat data in approximately 50 to 70 milliseconds. Human intracranial recordings captured this timing directly, as Mendes Bertolo and colleagues recorded in Nature Neuroscience. The same visual information reaches the visual cortex for conscious identification in approximately 150 to 200 milliseconds. The amygdala receives a crude sketch of the scene, shape and movement, and contrast, and makes a threat classification on incomplete data while the cortex is still assembling the image into something you can name. The survival logic is simple. The organism that fired the threat response 50 milliseconds before conscious identification survived encounters that the organism waiting for full identification did not. The system is tuned for sensitivity over accuracy. Fire first, identify later. The cost of a false alarm is wasted adrenaline and a racing heart. The cost of a missed threat is death. The 50 to 70 millisecond head start exists because the evolutionary math always favored the false alarm. Every single ancestor whose amygdala fired at a shadow and wasted an adrenaline surge survived. Every ancestor whose amygdala waited for cortical confirmation before responding to the shadow did not survive the encounters where the shadow was a predator. The system is calibrated for a world where false alarms cost energy and missed threats cost everything. The calibration is not updated for a world where most shadows are coiled ropes and most threats are social rather than physical. And that crude sketch is enough. A curved shape on a path triggers the amygdala's threat classification at the resolution of shape and contrast alone, before the cortex determines whether the shape is a snake or a coiled rope. Cold hands arrive while the cortex is still processing. By the time the conscious mind decides the shape is a rope, the cascade has already deployed through 8 organ systems. You have experienced this mismatch hundreds of times. The shadow in the parking garage that made your heart pound before you saw it was a jacket on a railing. The loud sound behind you that made your shoulders clench before you identified it as a car door closing. The figure at the edge of your peripheral vision that made you flinch before your cortex resolved it as a coat rack. Each time the amygdala fired and the body responded before the cortex could confirm or deny. Each time the cascade was already running by the time the conscious mind arrived with the answer. The 50 to 70 millisecond pathway is why fear arrives before the reason for the fear. The reason always comes later. The body was already preparing. The mismatch between the speed of the fear and the speed of the identification is the reason you sometimes feel foolish after a false alarm. The embarrassment of flinching at a coat rack is the cortex arriving a full 200 milliseconds after the amygdala with the corrected information and finding the body already in full cascade. The body cannot wait for the correction. The amygdala acts on incomplete data because complete data arrives too late to matter in a genuine threat. The system traded accuracy for speed because the evolutionary survival math demanded the trade, and the neural architecture that resulted from that trade fires before the conscious mind can participate in the decision. What does the cascade do to the body in the 200 milliseconds after the amygdala fires? Two pathways launch simultaneously from the amygdala. The fast pathway runs through the brainstem to the adrenal glands, releasing adrenaline and noradrenaline directly into the bloodstream within 200 milliseconds. The slow pathway runs through the hypothalamus and pituitary to the adrenal cortex, releasing cortisol over minutes. The fast pathway produces the immediate symptoms. The slow pathway sustains them. Well, the fast pathway reaches 8 systems, and each one produces a sensation you recognize. Heart. Adrenaline reaches the pacemaker cells and the heart rate jumps from resting to 120 within seconds. The pounding in the chest that arrives before you have finished processing what scared you is the pacemaker responding to a chemical signal the amygdala dispatched before the cortex finished assembling the image. Gut. Blood leaves the digestive organs as the arteries feeding the gut constrict. The blood redirects to the skeletal muscles that would fight or flee. The gut dropping is blood leaving the splanchnic circulation, the physical sensation of the digestive system losing its entire fuel supply in seconds. Hands and feet. Peripheral arteries constrict, pulling blood away from the extremities and concentrating it in the core and the large muscle groups. The cold hands are the body reducing potential blood loss from a limb injury that has not happened yet. Vision. The pupils dilate. Peripheral visual processing suppresses to sharpen central focus. The tunnel vision is attentional narrowing, the brain concentrating all of its available processing power on the threat at the cost of everything in the periphery. Liver. Adrenaline triggers the release of stored glucose into the bloodstream within 60 seconds. The sudden energy surge that arrives alongside the fear is the liver dumping its glycogen reserves into the blood to fuel muscles that may need to sprint. Clotting. Platelet activity and clotting factor concentrations increase. The blood becomes more coagulable within 60 seconds of the cascade firing. The body preparing for wound closure before any wound is opened, the blood chemistry shifting toward rapid sealing because the amygdala classified the situation as physically dangerous before the cortex determined whether physical danger was actually present. Breathing. The bronchioles dilate, the respiratory rate climbs from 14 breaths per minute to 25 or 30, and the intercostal muscles activate for maximum ventilation. The chest tightness that accompanies fear is the respiratory system switching from quiet breathing to emergency ventilation, the muscles between the ribs contracting harder than they contract during any other waking activity. The unfamiliar chest sensation feels like a breathing problem because the body has never required this respiratory effort outside of heavy exercise, and the context of fear reframes the sensation as respiratory distress rather than respiratory preparation. 8 systems in 200 milliseconds, each one producing a sensation you have felt during every significant fear response of your entire life. The cold hands, the pounding heart, the dropped gut, the tunnel vision, the energy surge, the tight chest. Each one of those sensations is a specific organ responding to a specific chemical signal, the amygdala dispatched before conscious identification was even complete. Now, the slow pathway sustains what the fast pathway started. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis drives what follows. Cortisol arrives minutes after the adrenaline and maintains the elevated state long after the initial surge clears. The fear that persists after the immediate threat passes is a different chemical from the one that started it. Adrenaline clears from the bloodstream within minutes, while cortisol persists for 30 to 60 minutes or longer. The lingering unease, the difficulty calming down, the heart rate that stays elevated for 20 minutes after the scare was clearly over, the replaying of the event in the mind long after the danger passed, is cortisol sustaining what the adrenaline initiated. Wondering why you cannot calm down after a scare is asking your conscious mind to override a chemical that will persist in the bloodstream for another 30 minutes, regardless of what the conscious mind decides. And cortisol does something the adrenaline does not. It feeds back to the amygdala and increases its sensitivity. The next stimulus that arrives while cortisol is still elevated triggers a larger amygdala response than it would at baseline. The fear system primes itself to fire more easily while it is still active. This is why a sequence of stressful events across a single day feels progressively worse rather than accumulating linearly. But cortisol from the morning confrontation was still circulating when the afternoon meeting produced its own cascade, and the amygdala fired at a lower threshold the second time because the cortisol from the first event had already sensitized it. You described the second stressful event as the one that broke me because you were experiencing a cascade that fired harder because the cortisol from the previous cascade had lowered the bar. The cascade fired through 8 systems in 200 milliseconds and sustained itself through cortisol from minutes to hours. Does the intensity of this cascade stay constant across the decades, or does something change the threshold at which the amygdala fires? Something changed. And it has been changing since you were 30. What shifts the threshold at which the amygdala decides to fire? Testosterone modulates the amygdala. Testosterone reaches the amygdala and shifts the firing threshold upward, requiring a stronger stimulus to trigger the full cascade. Higher testosterone produces measurably lower amygdala activation to threatening stimuli, as functional imaging during threat exposure has established. The hormone raises the bar the threat signal must clear before the cascade deploys. Testosterone declines approximately 1 to 2% per year after 30. By 60, the level sits at approximately 55 to 75% of where it was at peak. The amygdala's threshold has been drifting downward with the declining modulation for 3 decades. The stimulus that would have been processed as mildly concerning at 30 produces a full cascade at 60 because the threshold it must cross has lowered year by year. You who feel more anxious with age, more reactive to small provocations, more easily startled by a door closing or a phone ringing, are experiencing the threshold shift. The situations that produced mild alertness at 30 produce genuine anxiety at 60 through that same amygdala circuit firing at a lower threshold. The change is gradual enough that most people attribute it to circumstances rather than to chemistry. The job became more stressful. The world became more dangerous. The neighborhood changed. The circumstances may have changed. The threshold definitely changed measurably through a hormonal decline that lowered the bar the threat signal must clear before the cascade fires. The threats may be the same, but the bar moved. The bar moved. And then, cortisol moves the bar in the opposite direction simultaneously. Cortisol potentiates the amygdala, increasing its sensitivity. Carrying elevated cortisol from visceral fat, chronic stress, or disrupted sleep means both modulators are moving against you at the same time. Testosterone declining, raising sensitivity from below. Cortisol rising, raising sensitivity from above. 2 hormonal shifts converging on the same circuit, each one independently bringing the amygdala closer to its firing threshold for any given stimulus. At 30, high testosterone and low cortisol required a strong threat signal to trigger the full cascade. The cascade fired for genuine dangers and let moderate provocations pass without a full deployment. At 60, reduced testosterone and elevated cortisol require a weaker signal to trigger that cascade. Situations that passed beneath the threshold at 30 now cross it. Social interactions that produce mild alertness now produce genuine physiological anxiety. The full 8-system deployment firing for stimuli the younger brain would have classified as non-threatening. The subjective experience is that the world became more threatening. The physiological reality is that the threshold lowered. The fear response at 60 is larger for that stimuli because 2 independent hormonal changes shifted the sensitivity in that direction across 3 decades. The cascade fires faster and harder at 60 than it did at 30 for identical stimuli through 2 hormonal changes you never connected to your increasing anxiety. The question the title promised to answer remains: what happens inside the brain when you step forward despite the cascade firing at full intensity? Having felt the cascade thousands of times, you know the fear. Stepping forward despite the cascade reveals that something changed afterward. The physics of that change is the second circuit. Predicted catastrophe absent, the body survived, and the prefrontal cortex registered the discrepancy. This is the pivot. Everything before this moment described what the fear does. Everything after describes what changes when you face it. When the feared stimulus occurs and the predicted outcome does not materialize, the prefrontal cortex generates an inhibitory signal to the amygdala, through a direct physical neural projection. The fear discussion described this architecture. The infralimbic region of the prefrontal cortex fires and dampens the amygdala's output. Each exposure to the feared stimulus without the predicted catastrophe strengthens this inhibitory connection, as Millad and Quirk established in biological psychiatry through longitudinal imaging of extinction learning. The connection is a physical synapse that builds incrementally, one exposure, one strengthening, and the fear memory in the amygdala persists permanently. The override builds alongside it. You who have faced a specific fear many times still carry the original fear memory intact in the amygdala. The amygdala fires the pattern it fired the first time the fear was encountered. The difference is that the prefrontal override now engages within milliseconds of the amygdala's firing, sending an inhibitory signal that dampens the cascade before it reaches full intensity. The heart still accelerates and the hands still cool. But the magnitude is reduced, and the recovery is faster because the braking signal arrived sooner than the cascade could fully deploy. The courage you felt after months of facing that fear was the override circuit operating alongside the fear circuit. The brake engaging at that time is the accelerator, resolving the cascade faster with every successful exposure. The 50th presentation still raises the heart rate in the 30 seconds before speaking. The hands still cool slightly. The gut still tightens, but the magnitude is a fraction of what it was the first time, and the recovery happens within the first 2 or 3 sentences instead of persisting through the entire presentation. The amygdala fires that pattern. The prefrontal brake catches it before the cascade reaches the intensity that would impair performance. The fear is present, but the override is faster. Describing this as getting used to it is describing synapse construction without knowing the architecture. Real, measurable, and also fragile in a specific way. The fear memory is permanent. The override requires maintenance through continued exposure. Stop facing the feared stimulus, and the inhibitory synapse weakens over weeks to months through a process called spontaneous recovery, where the original fear response returns toward its pre-extinction intensity. The brake works, but the brake requires use. The maintenance requirement is specific. The feared stimulus must be encountered and the predicted catastrophe must fail to materialize. Each successful encounter reinforces the inhibitory synapse. Each period of avoidance allows the synapse to weaken toward baseline. The relationship between use and strength follows the logic of muscle maintenance, where contractile protein degrades without the loading signal that tells the muscle to maintain it. The override degrades without the exposure signal that tells the prefrontal cortex to maintain it. The speaker who gave presentations every week for 5 years and then stopped for a year returns to the podium and finds the heart pounding nearly as hard as it did the first time. The override that took years of weekly exposure to build weakened across 12 months of disuse because the synapse received no reinforcement. The return of the fear feels like failure because the expectation was that courage, once earned through years of exposure, was permanent. Courage was the override operating, and the override requires ongoing use. Brake requires use. I lined my own fear recovery timeline against the override the month the circuit architecture became specific. The public speaking that terrified me at 20 and merely elevated my heart rate at 40 was the prefrontal brake operating alongside an amygdala that still fired the original pattern every single time. The fear was unchanged, but the brake was stronger. 20 years of stepping forward had built the synapse that dampened it. Override construction speed depends on BDNF, the growth factor the walking discussion described. Brake builds faster with help. BDNF, the growth factor that increases hippocampal volume and synaptic density, also acts on the prefrontal cortex. Elevated BDNF accelerates synaptic remodeling in the prefrontal regions that construct the inhibitory projection to the amygdala. Regular exercise produces higher baseline BDNF levels, and the elevated BDNF accelerates the rate at which the prefrontal override synapse strengthens during fear extinction. The construction that takes 20 exposures at low BDNF may take 12 at elevated BDNF. Walking builds the fear override faster through that molecule that grows the memory structure exercise produces. The connection is practical, beginning a program of facing a specific fear while simultaneously maintaining regular aerobic exercise constructs the override synapse faster than facing the fear without the exercise. The BDNF does not replace the exposure. The exposure is mandatory because the prefrontal cortex requires the outcome data to build the synapse. The BDNF accelerates the construction once the data arrives. Exercise alone without exposure builds nothing because the synapse requires the fear then safety sequence. Exposure alone without exercise builds the synapse to the baseline rate. Exposure with exercise builds it faster because the molecular environment supports more rapid synaptic remodeling. Well, the override dampens the cascade's intensity. A separate system determines how quickly the cascade resolves once it fires. The vagal brake, vagal tone, the parasympathetic counterweight to the sympathetic fear cascade, determines how rapidly the heart rate returns to baseline after the cascade fires. Higher vagal tone means significantly faster recovery. The heart that stayed elevated at 120 beats per minute for 5 full minutes after a fear stimulus at low vagal tone settles back to its resting rate in 90 seconds at high vagal tone. The cascade fired identically in both cases. The parasympathetic recovery engaged sooner in the second, the braking was faster. Extended exhale breathing, the technique for activating the parasympathetic system, trains vagal tone over weeks of practice. Practicing extended exhales builds a stronger parasympathetic brake into every fear response. Recovering faster from cascades, the amygdala will continue to fire regardless of how strong the prefrontal override becomes. The distinction matters because the prefrontal override and the vagal brake serve different functions in this recovery. The override reduces the peak, the maximum intensity the cascade reaches before the dampening signal arrives. The vagal brake reduces the tail, the duration the cascade persists after the peak has passed. A person with a strong override and weak vagal tone experiences a mild cascade that lingers for 10 minutes. A person with weak override and strong vagal tone experiences a full cascade that resolves in 90 seconds. A person with both experiences a mild cascade that resolves quickly. Two entirely separate braking systems, two targets, two timelines. Stepping back carries a cost that is specific and measurable. Avoiding the feared stimulus never provides the prefrontal cortex with the outcome data it requires to build the override. Avoidance maintains the fear through two mechanisms simultaneously. The amygdala's threat prediction is never disconfirmed by real-world experience, so the prediction strengthens with each repetition, and the relief that follows every act of avoidance reinforces the avoidance behavior through negative reinforcement, making the next avoidance more likely. Each single step backward simultaneously strengthens the fear circuit and starves the override circuit of the experience it requires to construct the inhibitory synapse. You cannot reason your way out of fear because the fear operates in a circuit the reasoning mind cannot access directly. Knowing that the plane is statistically safe changes nothing about the amygdala firing during turbulence because the amygdala receives its raw threat data through the 50 millisecond subcortical pathway, and the statistical knowledge resides in the cortex at 200 milliseconds. The rational understanding arrives too late to prevent the cascade that already deployed. The prefrontal override builds exclusively from experience, from the body going through the full experience of turbulence and arriving safely on the other side, from the prefrontal cortex carefully logging the discrepancy between the predicted catastrophe and the actual outcome. The body must go through the entire cascade and arrive at the other side for the synapse to strengthen. Avoidance provides comfort and prevents construction simultaneously. The comfort is real and immediate. The relief of choosing to step back instead of forward is a genuine neurochemical reward, a drop in cortisol, a reduction in sympathetic activation, a return to perceived safety and calm that the brain logs as the correct response to the threat. The brain learned that avoidance worked, where worked means the distress ended. The distress ended because the stimulus was removed, and the brain registered the removal as the solution. The solution was real in the moment. The cost was invisible because the cost was an absence, the absence of a synapse that was never constructed, the absence of an override that was never given the data to build from. The override was never built because the outcome was never tested. The comfort was purchased with the only currency the override accepts for construction, direct experience with the feared stimulus and survival of the outcome. Now you who have been avoiding a specific fear for years have an amygdala response that is strengthened through repeated prediction without disconfirmation, a prefrontal override that has weakened through disuse, a testosterone level that has lowered the firing threshold across decades, and potentially an elevated cortisol level that has further sensitized the circuit. 4 independent variables converging on a single fear response that grows larger with each year of avoidance. The fear at 60 feels overwhelming precisely because four independent changes have amplified it, while the one mechanism that dampens it, the prefrontal override, received no experience to build from. You at 60 who have been avoiding a specific fear since 40 have 20 years of threshold decline, 20 years of override degradation, and 20 years of amygdala prediction strengthening, all converging on a single stimulus. The fear grew measurably with every passing year, the break weakened measurably every year, and the subjective experience of the fear growing larger was accurate because it was growing larger through measurable changes in the circuits that produce it and the circuits that fail to dampen it. Hands went cold in 50 to 70 milliseconds. The heart rate jumped before the eyes finished processing the scene. The gut dropped as blood left the digestive organs. The vision narrowed, the glucose spiked, and the clotting factors mobilized. 8 systems deploying in 200 milliseconds, preparing the body for a danger the cortex had not yet confirmed. Then you stepped forward anyway. The feared outcome did not arrive. The prefrontal cortex registered the discrepancy and began constructing an inhibitory connection to the amygdala, one synapse, one exposure. The next time the amygdala fired for that stimulus, the override engaged slightly faster than the time before. The fear fired at full intensity. The recovery was shorter. The fear circuit was built in 50 to 70 milliseconds. The override circuit was built across months of stepping forward. Both exist in this same brain, built through different physics, operating on different timescales, growing or weakening with every choice. You who step forward build the break. Every exposure strengthened a synapse the avoidance would have stopped. Every recovery that came faster than the previous one was evidence that the construction was working, that the synapse was strengthening. The fear circuit was designed to fire in 50 to 70 milliseconds because the survival margin demanded speed over accuracy. The override circuit was designed to build slowly because the accuracy of the override demanded repeated real-world confirmation before the break could be trusted. Speed for danger, patience for safety. You who step forward build the override. You who step back strengthen the circuit that fires without one.